The cowboy promised his dying friend he'd marry her. She was poor scarred, yet stronger than him. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, enjoy the story. The wind howled long and low across the snow-covered prairie, sweeping over the bare hills like the mourning cry of the earth itself. Inside a dim tent, the oil lamp flickered its pale yellow glow, trembling as if ready to die, casting thin shadows over two men shivering against the storm. A rasping cough tore through the silence. Elias Carter, his frame wasted, his hand damp with fever, clutched his friend's wrist. When you reach Silver Creek, find Carol. Don't let her be alone. Marry her. Promise me. Randy Mallister tightened his grip on the saddle strap beside him, jaw locked hard. Outside, hooves pounded over frozen ground. Chains of wind shrieked sharp as knives. He could see no future, only the fading eyes of his friend, and a name that had just been bound to his soul. In that moment, the cowboy carried more than a vow. He chained his fate to a woman he had never met. Wyoming winter of 1879. The blizzard ripped apart the night as though it meant to swallow the prairie whole. Across the frozen land, cattle sheds huddled low against the gale, their lantern lights quivering like the last breath of life. Far off the rail line stood abandoned boxcars, locked in silence beneath a sheath of ice. In Silver Creek, the saloon had gone quiet. No banjo, no laughter, only the groan of its wooden door straining under each gust. Beyond the desert flats, the wind rose in long warnings, daring men to stand against this land. And into that scene rode Randy Mallister, 34 years old, a quiet cowboy with a sun-worn face and steady eyes that had long grown used to looking death in the eye. His wide-brimmed hat sagged heavy with snow boots dusted with the miles, and his rough hands rested always near the butt of his gun, as natural to him as breath. They called him the man of his word, for Randy never made a promise he did not see through. But tonight, in that storm-shaken tent, his hand pressed to the last keepsake of a dying friend, a handkerchief stitched with the letter E. The price of honor was not measured in gun smoke or blood, but in a vow that bound his very destiny. And waiting out there in the town ahead was a scarred young woman carrying her own losses, and a future Randy had never dared to imagine. If it were you, if you were the cowboy riding into this town, what would be the first thing you'd do? Part 1. The Man Who Kept His Word. The blizzard swept across the mountain range like a pack of white wolves, howling, tearing, devouring all that remained. In the skin-splitting cold, a small circle of cowboys gathered around a shallow grave. The ground was frozen hard, so hard that it took axes and crowbars to break it open, each strike echoing like a muffled cry. Randy Mallister stood apart from the others, wide-brim hat, heavy with snow breath, curling in white mist, his eyes shadowed with grief. Before him, beneath a rough canvas sheet, lay the still body of Elias Carter, the boy who had grown up beside him, the friend who once dragged him out of a raging river when he was 15, now nothing more than a hushed outline sinking into the snow. There was no priest here, only the wind and the calloused hands of Western men. A wooden cross, hammered together from a broken corral post, was planted into the frozen earth. They fell silent, removed their hats, and bowed their heads. Randy knelt down, laying a handkerchief embroidered with the letter E upon his friend's chest. His eyes did not spill tears, but inside was a sorrow deeper than any wailing could reach. He whispered, his voice carried into the storm. "You pulled me from the river that day. Now, I'll carry your word forward." A gust tore across the prairie, lifting the loose earth over the canvas, as if the land itself answered harsh but honest. "Nothing endures here but a promise." The burial ended quickly. The others pulled their coats tight and hurried back to the tents. Only Randy remained, his broad shoulders alone against the blizzard, standing motionless until the snow erased every footprint from the grave. That night, in a canvas tent trembling like a sail ready to tear, Randy sat by the oil lamp alone. He spread what little Elias had left, a silver watch with a chipped edge, a stub of pencil worn to nothing, a few carefully folded letters, and the handkerchief stitched in pale blue. He opened the letters. Carol Dawson's handwriting was steady, resilient, neither flowery nor pleading. Her words came from faraway Kansas, telling of a burned-down sewing shop, of the scar across her face that made people whisper, but also of hands that never stopped mending, and a heart that refused to bow. Randy folded the paper again. His gaze caught on her name at the bottom. A woman he had never met. Yet from this night on, she was his destiny. He packed the keepsakes into a leather satchel, then checked his revolver, the knife hidden in his boot, the lariat coiled tight by the saddle. Every piece of gear belonged to a seasoned cowboy, but this time the load weighed heavier than any cattle drive. It carried a vow that could not be set down. The wind keened outside, pulling him back into memories, Elias's gravelly laugh as they outran a storm in Colorado. The time he stood in front of a drunk man's gun inside a saloon. Elias always chose to protect, always chose to keep his word. Now that last choice bound Randy tighter than a noose. The night stretched long. Randy sat in silence, hand resting on the keepsake, eyes on the lamp's trembling glow. His heart was not one that cried easily, but silence itself can sometimes be the cruelest grief. Morning came clear, but bitter. The prairie lay white and still broken only by the whip of wind against the tent poles. Randy saddled his chestnut stallion, the loyal animal snorting clouds of steam into the frozen air. He strapped the satchel, the keepsakes, and a few scraps of food to the saddle. The others in camp watched as he mounted. Some nodded. Some whispered, "Mallister." "Where's he headed in the dead of winter?" He did not answer, just swung into the saddle, pulled his hat low, and rode. The horse's hooves drummed against the snow, each strike like a funeral drum. With every mile, the grave of his friend grew distant, yet the weight in his chest grew heavier still. The road to Silver Creek was no mercy, a white wasteland of prairie-frozen rivers and rockfall canyons that tested the will of any man. But Randy had lived his life against hardship. He was not one who turned back. By dusk, he stopped at a frozen creek and lit a small fire with rare dry twigs. The flames sputtered low, the smoke torn by wind like wandering ghosts. He ate a strip of jerky in silence, the light outlining a weathered face, eyes deep solitude etched deeper than any scar. In the glow, Elias's fading eyes returned, whispering one last plea. "Don't let her be alone." Randy bowed his head, fist closing hard over the handkerchief in his pocket. 3 days' ride brought the first glimpse of Silver Creek, a smudge of dust on the horizon. A handful of wooden buildings, a main street littered with sand and horse dung. A saloon with a sagging sign banjo notes drifting weakly through its window. Beyond it, a rail depot sat idle boxcars, rusting under red grit. A train whistle, echoing faintly like a call from another world. Randy reined in atop the ridge, studying the town. Children ran across the dirt road. A cluster of men lounged in front of the saloon hands, near their holsters out of old habit. It looked ordinary. Yet he knew one whisper about a woman with scars, and every eye would turn sharp. His hand brushed the pocket where Carol's letters lay. She had not asked for pity, only respect. But Randy knew Silver Creek was not quick to offer respect to anyone marked by scars, which meant he himself would have to be her shield. He urged the horse down the slope. Hooves struck the ground, the sound carrying ahead like a herald. A cowboy of his word was coming bearing the keepsake of the dead and a destiny yet unseen. At the livery by the rail yard, the old one-eyed keeper eyed him suspiciously. "Name," the man rasped. Malister Randy answered short. Nothing more was asked. But by nightfall, the whispers had already begun in the saloon. The cowboys come to town, came for a promise to the dead. Randy sat alone at a corner table, whiskey untouched. Around him the lamplight flickered. The piano stumbled through broken chords. Spurs clinked on the boards. He neither joined the talk of the men nor looked at the painted girls who laughed in clusters. His mind carried only one thought. Tomorrow she will step down from the coach, and I will be standing there. His hand rested on the grip of his gun, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A man must always be ready, not just for strangers, but for fate. That night, when he left the saloon, the snow had thinned, falling soft as ashes. He passed the small wooden church candlelight, leaking faint through the cracks. The bell tolled cold, a reminder that every vow carried its price. Back in his room, he placed the embroidered handkerchief on the table, staring at it for a long time, alone, heavy but unbending. For he knew tomorrow every eye in Silver Creek would fall on him, the man who kept his word. Part 2. She appeared midday, in Silver Creek, burned yellow, like a brass kettle set over open fire. Dust rolled along the main street, rising against the faces of dry wooden houses. On the saloon porch, a handful of cowboys leaned back against the posts, boot heels tapping on the boards. The scrape of spurs, sharp as iron, dropped in a porcelain bowl. Beyond the little rail depot exhaled steam, its bell clanking mournfully in the brittle wind. Folks gathered at the station necks, craning long as a flock of herons waiting for fish. The steel wheels shrieked against the rail, and soon a coach appeared in a halo of dust. Its paint was chipped, its body worn. Bill Cranford hauled on the reins, the team lathered manes crusted with dust that fell onto the hems of the women waiting close by. From the door stepped a stooped peddler, clutching a chest no bigger than half a corn pot. Then a mother, with her child eyes sunken from the long road. The door swung again. A gloved hand appeared, fingers slender, steady. The hem of a deep blue dress brushed the step. And then she stood straight as a boundary marker. A small brimmed hat shadowed her brow, her brown hair pinned neatly. A faint scar traced from her left cheek down toward her jaw, not robbing her beauty, but sharpening it like a blade tempered in fire that refused to break. The crowd murmured, "That must be her. Doesn't look like one who begs. That scar. Fire, maybe." Children tugged at their mother's skirts to stare. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron and looked up. Golden dust swirled around the woman, like drifting ash. Randy Mallister stood apart, brim low, his shadow long on the ground. His back was stiff, left hand resting near the grip of his Colt. Not as a threat, only the habit of a man who had steadied chaos among stampeding herds. A dry wind tugged his coat aside, just enough to show the white handkerchief with its pale blue E tucked in his pocket. The woman's eyes swept the faces before her, not shying, as if reading a hidden map across each stranger. When her gaze found Randy, the gray of her eyes lingered half a beat. She walked straight to him without lowering her head. "Mr. Mallister," she said. Her voice was clear, neither high nor refined, each word standing upright as she did. "I am Carol Dawson." Randy tipped his hat. "Miss Dawson." The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere a chair creaked. A pup barked twice, then hushed. Carol turned her head, so the noon light brushed across the scar. "Before we speak further," she said loud enough that the whispers choked off, "I must be plain if your promise was born of pity. I'll refuse here and now." A single strand of hair slipped loose against her cheek. No one dared laugh. Randy lifted his eyes, met hers. "I didn't promise out of pity," he said, voice low, steady as oak. "I promised for a man who lived true until his very last breath." The words struck the ground like a heavy coin, silencing every murmur. On the saloon porch, one fellow thought to chuckle, then spat instead, looking away. Carol's shoulders eased just a fraction. She nodded once. "Then we should speak somewhere else. Not here beneath dust and stairs." Randy inclined his head. After a still moment, he turned to make a path. They walked side by side, the crowd parting like water from stone. Eyes followed them, but what trembled now was not the label of scarred woman. It was the old belief that the weak must bow. The back room of Murphy's General Store smelled of coffee mixed with lamp oil and tanned leather. A tall window clung to its dust. A winter fly beat itself against the pane, tapping like fingers on time. Shelves carried spools of blue thread beside nails and a pair of scissors worn smooth in the handle. Randy set his hat on a flour barrel, planted his boots just wide enough to seem steady but not imposing. Carol kept a step between them, removed her gloves, and laid them on the table. On her forefinger was a round callus, the mark of a life spent holding a needle. "Your friend Carol wrote me a letter that promised not love, but respect. Work. A home. I came on that word. Not to flee, but to begin again." Randy nodded once. He drew from his pocket the handkerchief wrapped in old soap paper tied with a bootlace. His large hands unwrapped it, showing the white cloth, the faint blue letter. "This," he said, "is yours, because it belongs to the promise that brought you here." He did not hand it directly, but placed it on the table between them, as if an old token of truth was to be claimed by whoever was willing to bear it. Carol's eyes softened on the cloth. Her lashes flickered, remembering that it is the smallest objects that hold memory the tightest. She touched its edge lightly, with the slightest tremor. The scar on her cheek caught the lamplight, no longer a brand of pity, but the mark of one who had endured. "I will not be a fixture in your house," she said, still looking at the lettered cloth. "I have a trade. I earn my keep. I will work until these hands can no longer guide a needle, and you do not ask me for what I cannot give." Randy listened the way a man listens to wind moving through mesquite. "You'll belong to no one as a possession," he said. "At my ranch, you'll be safe. And the rest will speak in deeds, not words. On his sleeve a button hung loose, a rare thing for Mallister, who kept his gear sharp. Carol noticed. Without a word, she reached for thread and a fine needle from her tin. Her hands stitched 2 strokes, 3 quick and steady, the sound like hoofbeats over wood. She bit the thread, leaving the cloth neat again. Next time, she said softly, voice, even as a frozen lake, don't let your shirt say you're unsettled. Randy looked at the stitch at her hands. It was not intimacy, but ritual, an unspoken claim of craft. He set his hat back on. This evening, he said, I'll take you to Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house. Tomorrow, we go to the church and do what must be done. Carol folded the handkerchief, tucked it into her breast pocket, with the blue letter showing outward like a kiss from the dead, worn close to her heart. Outside, the sun was lowering past the saloon roofline. Wind shifted, carrying whiskey horse sweat and frying fat. The men still lingered. One younger, with drink in his eyes, spat through his teeth. So you're Elias's sewing woman, huh? Carol turned before Randy could speak. I'm Carol Dawson, she said. Nothing more. Her name landed like a steel card on a table. The boy sneered. Round here, women in saloons know their place. Laughter cracked thin across the porch. Randy turned, half his body hand resting light on the Colt. Not drawn, just there. Enough to thicken the silence. And round here, Carol replied, men know the difference between one who comes to drink and one who means to pass through. She walked on stride, unbroken. The boy shifted half a step, sweat bright on his brow. The blacksmith's hand dropped heavy on his hammer without thought. The air stretched taut. Randy spoke low, almost gentle. Go on home, Clay. He didn't look at the boy, only at the road ahead of Carol. His words like those given to a young colt near to spook. Clay swallowed hard. The liquor had softened his knees. He spat again, but weaker. Not your business, Mallister. I keep the road clear for those who walk straight, Randy answered. The words carried no blade, but enough frost to still the fever in Clay's blood. Carol's hem stayed free of spit and whiskey. If fear touched her, it passed like smoke in the eye. She did not turn back. Randy followed at her shoulder's length, not covering her, but marking guard. Behind them, the saloon porch mirrored their figures like 2 strokes of ink, one bold, one fine. Women at lace-curtained windows watched, some eyes softening. A mother bent to her daughter. See, that is how one stands when the world would push you down. When they reached the square, the town piano shifted from a jangle to a slow, simple tune. 2 notes repeating steady. Clay slumped onto the steps, hand over his eyes. The blacksmith struck iron sparks, rising like a final line in a stage play. They stopped at the public well. Carol undid the top button of her dress, only to breathe. Sweat dried quick on her brow. Thank you, she said at last, not looking at him for not making a show of it. Fights make folks remember me, Randy replied, leaning a hand on the stone rim. I'd rather they remember the way you stood. For the first time, Carol's smile curved faint thin as a drawn thread that holds without breaking. I didn't come to be a spectacle. I came to work to live and to keep my back straight. At the far edge of town, the freight train wailed black crows, lifting off the church roof like inked wings. Silver Creek had just seen what it was unready for a woman who walked through scorn without bowing, and a cowboy who followed without claiming front. The afternoon lowered like a brown cloth over the valley. They passed the small church on the rise. Its door stood open, the inside empty, the smell of wax and old wood drifting out a silent hymn. Carol paused, eyes on the worn step that told of all who had come seeking peace. "Where did you bury Elias?" she asked. "Up in the mountain," Randy said. "Wind strong, ground hard. A wooden cross. No flowers. No flowers needed," Carol murmured, stepping inside. She sat in the front pew back, as straight as always. Randy stood in the aisle, hat in hand. At the end, she asked carefully, "Did he suffer much?" Randy's voice came slow. The wind shook the lamp near out. "He burned with fever, but clear to the last. He said your hands never tired at work. He believed you'd build something out of ashes." Carol's fingers traced the pew's rough edge. "The night the shop burned," she said evenly, "I carried out the cash box. I fell. Fire took my face. By morning, folks looked at me different. Not for being poor, for being scarred." Randy said nothing to fill the silence. He only saw the shoulders tremble once, then steady the calm of one who had learned pain by refusing to cry. "I came," she went on, "because I wouldn't let their stares choose my needle. Elias gave me a line of words, not a vow, but straight enough that I could set my feet on new ground without bowing." Randy stepped forward half a pace. He set his hat on the bench, drew out the handkerchief she had tucked, and held it in both hands. "Keep it with you tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we sign a book. Not yet a full marriage, but enough that the wind won't mock you." Carol took it. She did not weep. She breathed deep, letting the clean cloth and its soap scent push away the last embers of old smoke. "And this," she added, eyes steady, "if ever this vow feels a chain to you, say so. I know the weight of chains." Randy looked to the window, where stray clouds drifted like tired sheep. "I live by knowing when to cut rope and when to tie fast," he said. "This one I tie." At the rear, a pew groaned, though empty wood, remembering old prayers. Carol stood, folded the handkerchief, pressing it to her chest, not as a cross, but like a first stitch in new cloth. Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house sat behind withered vines, its porch worn smooth by years of boots. The Polish woman, round and flushed from the stove, handed Carol a key. Big room. Clean. Soft pillows. "You want warm water?" "Ask," she said in thick accent. Carol thanked her eyes, flicking to the stair rail, polished by countless palms. Randy leaned against a post, reins in hand. "I'll stay by the stable," he said. "In the morning, I'll take you to Murphy's. See about a room for sewing if you still want it." "If I still want it." Carol's smile came faint, easily missed. "I've no other trade. Folks judge scars quicker than stitches, but stitches I control." From a porch across the street, two women whispered, watching. "Scars long, that one." Mallister put her in the best boarding house. Carol heard, but did not turn. Her shoulders stayed square, as if her dress itself were both curtain and armor. Tonight, Randy said, "Lock your door. Keep the lamp low. Silver Creek is mostly decent, but I don't gamble. And if you see a shadow linger at your window, it may be me. Just to be sure no one else lingers too long." "You needn't do that," Carol answered. Not to refuse, but to measure the line between guarding and claiming. Randy understood. He nodded, tied his horse, pulled his brim low. Inside, Carol unpacked a small frame cloth, spools of thin notebook. She set the handkerchief on the table beside the wash bowl. She cracked the window. Cold air and straw scent drifted in. Outside, boots thudded steady Randy closing latches, like a man sealing drafts in a half-built house. She washed her face. Her fingers brushed the scar. Cold now. No more pain. Only memory. The night of flames, the fall, the fire-licking skin. She pressed the cloth to her cheek. Smooth. Done, she whispered to herself. Done so I can begin. She sat at the desk, opened her book. Wrote room rent first week. Need window space at Murphy's. Wooden sign. CW. Repair. Teach. At the bottom, a single line tomorrow sign name. Not a chain. A roof of my own making. The hall creaked. Voices whispered. Carol shut the book, blew the lamp. Darkness folded soft against the walls. Outside, the horse snorted. A man coughed once short to remind himself he was still awake. Carol moved to the curtain, peeking through. There he was, leaning against a post, arms crossed, eyes on the dark sky between roofs. Not posturing, simply present. She let the curtain fall. In the dark, her heart eased a notch. Not because someone stood below, but because for the first time since the fire, she could sleep without clutching a cash box to her chest. Before lying down, she slid the handkerchief beneath her pillow, a white corner showing like the bookmark of a story turning its page. She closed her eyes. Outside, wind-circled spurs chimed, distant timbers groaned, and somewhere within it all, a promise held steady as reins in a firm hand. Tomorrow, stand tall, sign the book, and stay. Would she dare to stay? Beyond the curtain, the man in the yard asked for no answer yet. Night in Silver Creek was deep as an old well. But come morning, when the church bell tolled, she would step into the dawn mist. And if anyone asked why she stayed, the answer was already sewn into the hem of a handkerchief, stitched in blue, strong as what could not be said. Part 3. No pity needed. Murphy's General Store smelled of fresh roasted coffee and lard soap. On the shelves, boxes of cartridges sat beside jars of sugar. Bolts of burlap leaned against barrels of salt. Folks here traded more than goods. They traded news and whispers. Randy pushed open the wooden door, guiding Carol through the cluttered aisles. Mr. Murphy watched them close his eyes, widening as if to remember each step. When Randy opened the back door, the noise of the store fell away, leaving only a small closed room light filtering through a dusty window. On the table, a wooden box, lay tilted spools of thread spilled from a basket. Carol removed her gloves and placed them neatly down. She turned, standing tall as an oak that had never broken in storm. Her gray eyes fixed on Randy, fearless. Mr. Mallister, Carol began. We should be clear from the start. I did not come here to be pitied. The words fell to the floorboards like a stone dropped into a deep well. Randy raised his brows, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. He wasn't used to women in this country speaking with steel in their voice. I came because Elias believed you would keep your word. Carol went on steady. But if your promise is charity, I'll turn my back this moment. I lost everything in one night of fire my shop, my honor, even my face. I will not lose my self-respect. Randy studied her long. In the pale light, the scar along her cheek did not make her small. If anything, it made her proud, like a mark carved by the land itself, a thing no one had the right to pity. He nodded, slowly. pulled off his gloves, and set them on the table. You'll have no pity from me. What I've carried all my life is respect. For a moment, they were no longer strangers, tied by a dying man's wish. They were two stubborn souls testing the strength of a rope, pulling it taut to see if it would hold. And it did not break. Silence hung like drifting smoke. Randy paced the small room, once his hand brushing a crooked map of Wyoming on the wall. Carol stood still, eyes following every move, measuring the distance between words and deeds. Elias wrote me, Randy said quietly, that you were not afraid of work. That's true, Carol replied. I can stitch a seam, even with the wind tearing the roof loose. I know how to keep myself alive and how to keep a house standing. The only thing I demand is an equal voice. Randy turned back his shadow, stretching long to touch the hem of her blue dress. As for me, he said, I've lived among men and horses. They follow orders, not debates. But here, he paused, met her gaze. Here I reckon we'll have to bargain, not command. The corner of Carol's mouth softened, not a smile, but an acknowledgement. Bargain, she echoed. That, too, is a form of respect. Randy reached into his satchel and drew out the handkerchief stitched with the letter E. He laid it on the table, nudging it toward her. This was the last thing he left. I brought it as proof. But from this day, it belongs to you. I'll keep only the memory. Carol's fingers trembled as they touched the cloth. She clasped at breath, catching low, as though holding a whole winter in her chest. Then from now on, she said, we begin with truth. No pity, no concealment. Her words stitched across the air like a seam closing a tear, the thread straight and binding. A gust slipped through the crack in the door, setting the dusty curtain swaying. Outside came the voices of children, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon banjo, a noisy chorus of Silver Creek. But in that narrow room, there were only two heartbeats. Carol stepped closer, her hand resting on the table near Randy's hat. What do you think, she asked plainly, of a woman with a scar? Randy didn't blink. I think a scar doesn't make you less. It only says, you survived. Carol drew in a long breath. Such simple words, but they struck like a hammer against the ice around her heart. For years she had lived with pitying looks, whispers behind her back. For the first time, someone had called the scar proof of survival. Tears threatened, but she held them, lashes trembling. She nodded, turning her face toward the window, letting the light dry what had not yet fallen. Randy did not intrude. He only stood steady, like a post-driven firm, in the earth, unmoving, unbroken. And that silence was the truest strength. Shadows grew outside dusk, pressing in. The oil lamp glowed weak, throwing their faces into gold and shadow. Carol sat down, back straight, fingers laced on her lap. Mr. Mallister, she said, I don't know what will become, but I need this clear. I will not be a shadow in your house. I will open a shop. I will work. I will teach other girls to earn by their hands. If you can allow me that, then I'll keep my word. Randy eased into the chair across from her. He pulled off his gloves again, laying them down as if setting aside his guard. Whatever you do, I won't stop it. I only aim to see that when the wind shifts, you won't stand alone. That's my part. Carol lifted her gaze. In the lamplight, his face was lined sober, without an ounce of empty charm. That very sternness convinced her his words were not fleeting. Silence stretched, Then Carol nodded slow, as if signing a contract without paper. Then, we can begin. Outside, the church bell tolled steady as the town's heartbeat. But to them, it marked a different bond. Not love, not pity, but a choice to endure together. When night fell, Randy left first, setting his hat, firm shoulders, broad and sure. Carol followed the handkerchief folded within her sleeve. As they stepped out into the street, the wind kicked up dust, carrying the scent of charred wood and horse sweat. The crowd had thinned, only a few drinkers lingering at the saloon. Randy tipped his head, speaking low. From now on, Silver Creek will test you. They'll watch, they'll push, but they'll learn you don't fall. Carol paused, eyes sweeping the row of weathered buildings, yellow light spilling across their tilted signs. I once stood alone in fire, she said softly. I'll not fear a few whispers. They walked on footsteps even. At the crossroads, Carol stopped, turning to face him. I'll walk beside you. But let this be plain. I need no pity. I need respect. If ever you forget that, I'll leave. The wind cut through, stretching their shadows long across the dirt. Randy nodded once without hesitation. I remember. For a moment, Silver Creek itself seemed to hush, as if the town had heard a pact just stitched in steel thread, stronger than any flowery vow. Carol turned away, her figure proud in the new moonlight. Randy stood watching, lips moving, as if to speak to the friend beneath the mountain snow. You see, Elias, she doesn't need pity. She needs the one thing I can give: respect. Then he turned for the stables, spurs striking wood in firm, unhurried rhythm. And in the western night, an invisible rope tightened a boundary, drawn sharp, unbreakable. Part 4. The Silent Wedding. Noon in Silver Creek stood still like an old photograph. The sun wasn't harsh, only a thin wash of gold spread across the weathered boards of the wooden church. The small bell under the eaves rang softly whenever the wind passed, its hollow tone like the long sigh of this dry land. Pine resin, fireplace ash, and sage drying on a windowsill mingled in the air, the familiar scent of the West Plain and steadfast. Randy Mallister arrived early. He tied his chestnut to the post, patted its neck, the saddle creaking in answer. On the steps, his dusty boots tapped twice against the planks, then stilled, a reminder to himself this was not a day for gunfights, but for laying something down. He removed his hat, drew in a deep breath, and felt a breeze move through his chest, unlike desert wind, the kind of wind that meant life was shifting. Inside, the church was near empty. Plain benches, and on the altar, only a clay jug holding wild sage stems. Reverend Thompson, his hair white as salt, wiped the glass over the large record book. He saw Randy and nodded, the kind of greeting between men who need few words. All right, Mallister, was all he asked. Randy nodded. His calm was like a fence post that had stood through many storms. Outside wheels rattled soft as the coach drew up. Carol Dawson stepped down, deep blue dress, small hat, her back straight. No hand reached to help because she needed none. Sunlight touched her cheek, glinting off the faint scar, making it shine like silver thread on fabric. She placed her hand on the railing for one breath, then pushed the door, eyes sweeping the church, not for grandeur, but to judge if this space could hold a simple vow upright. A few townsfolk had come, Mrs. Dobbins with a plate of small cakes, Mr. Murphy with a curt nod, two ranch hands by the door, like fresh-hewn posts. They did not gossip. They simply were there. and that quiet presence made the church feel less empty, less cold. Carol stepped forward, stopping beside Randy. The pale blue E showed faint at the pocket of her dress, the handkerchief folded square, a whisper of the dead. Randy bent his head and spoke low, only for her. Here we speak, little keep much. Carol met his eyes without flinching. And bear the weight of what we keep. The wooden bell struck again. Reverend Thompson closed the book, drew out a quill. He did not speak long on marriage. He only said, "If you've words to vow, speak them. If not, then sign." Dust floated in a shaft of sunlight, waiting reverent. He motioned them forward before the altar. The book lay open, Silver Creek's name faded at the top. 2 blank lines beneath, waiting for signatures. No rings, no flowers, only wood ink and human presence. Randy looked straight into Carol's eyes. He did not recite any borrowed vow. He spoke as a cowboy speaks slow spare, but each word standing upright. I keep my word. I do not leave when winds turn. I put a hot meal on the table, and if you need my silence, I'll keep it there. If you need my voice, I'll give it. I protect my home with what I do not, with noise. Carol breathed steady. The shadow of her hat deepened the gray of her eyes. She did not tremble. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but sharp and sure as a needle placed true in cloth. I do not ask pity, and I am no man's possession. I place my work on this table needle thread, ledger's lessons for girls who want to stand on their own feet. I keep my voice even when the stove grows cold, even when gossip circles. I guard it as I guard my honor, mine and yours. A draft stirred the sage stems. In the light, Randy saw in her scar, not a burn, but a glow like embers hidden still warm. He added one last line unplanned. I will not promise what I cannot do. I only vow what I can. And I will, until these hands can no longer lift a cup to you. The Reverend nodded faintly, pen trembling just enough to show his age. I have heard fine words in this church, but only the fewest last the winter. You two have spoken little. That is well. Mrs. Dobbins cleared her throat and offered a sprig of sage. All I could bring. Carol took it, laying it on the altar, the smell rising warm, like simple soup at dusk. Now sign, the Reverend said, sliding the book toward them. Before God, this wood, and those present. No one told them to hold hands. No rings passed. But when Randy set the quill to paper, Carol steadied the page with 2 fingers, keeping it from trembling in the draft. A small gesture, unnoticed by all but the 2 of them, and it kept the ink true. The quill scratched soft as a knife edge that leaves no cut, but marks to endure. Randy wrote clean, Randy Mallister. The R slanted like a tree bracing wind. He set the pen down, breathed once, then Carol. Her calloused finger gripped the quill heritage of 1,000 stitches. She wrote, Carol Dawson. The letters, even bold patient, each stroke like a seam closing worn cloth. The Reverend signed witness, pressed the parish seal, its stamp worn thin. He closed the book hand, resting on it as if over a child's sleep. Done, he said. No trumpets, no firecrackers. Only what endures. Mr. Murphy coughed, drew a small bottle from his coat. A sip to warm you, he muttered. Randy shook his head. Tonight. Carol also declined. Mrs. Dobbins pressed 2 warm cakes into Carol's hand. Few guests, few cakes, she said, eyes smiling. But the flour was needed while thinking of a roof that doesn't leak. Carol held the cake-tight gratitude stitching slow through her chest. She looked around, rough faces, rough hands, hearts not rough. people who had not left her standing alone. "Thank you," she whispered, sure. One young ranch hand stepped shyly from the door, pulling from his hat a sprig of sage clearly plucked by the fence. "For you," he mumbled, ears red. Randy gave him a single nod. No praise, no clap, just the nod, enough to mean respect. Sunlight angled through the window, painting a bright rectangle on the floor. For a moment, Randy and Carol stood in it together. No one told them to smile. No one asked for a picture. They simply breathed, letting the light pass like a baptism of sun. The Reverend closed the service with one sentence: "Treat each other as you treat the winter few words, much firewood, and knowing when to be still." The church chuckled softly, not to break the ice, but to accept that the ice remained and they would keep the fire anyway. When they stepped onto the porch, the wind shifted, carrying the cold smell of the valley earth. On the street, a stranger's horse clattered once, then moved on. Across at the saloon porch, men squinted, but no laughter followed. The silence in Silver Creek had changed color, less curious, a touch more respectful. Randy offered his hand. Not to pull Carol down the steps, she didn't need that. He offered it like signing a second paper one without ink. Carol studied it, broad knuckles, small scars from rains. She set her hand in his, not tight, not slack. "Honest." "That's done," Randy said, his voice low as wind crossing a ridge. "We'll head to the boarding house. This evening, I'll speak to Murphy about a corner room. Tomorrow, you hang your sign." Carol nodded. "The sign will read CW, repair, teach." She paused, then added softly, like an extra stitch, "and perhaps a corner for mending what can't be seen." Randy understood. He nodded, asked no more. Mrs. Dobbins pressed a square of linen into Carol's hand. "For your first curtain." Carol touched it, the weave, rough warm, as a blessing. Mr. Murphy crossed his arms, muttered, without looking at them, "First month's rent? Pay later." Carol raised her eyes. "No, I pay full. Then pay." "By the month," he said, still turned away. Randy caught the faint twist of his lips, the kind of smile a man hides when trying to be kind. A boy ran past, sleeve torn at the elbow. Carol's eyes followed, pausing on the bare patch of skin. She turned to Randy. "This afternoon I'll need a wooden board, some nails, black and white paint, and a low stool for children." Randy said, "Done." They stepped off the porch. Randy's spurs struck firm, steady. Carol's hem brushed dust. The handkerchief in her palm was cool. One thing had ended, another begun. No music, no fireworks. Only a handshake a step, and a town showing respect by not spitting in the dust. Evening settled slow over Silver Creek. Windows glowed behind thin curtains, lanterns hidden like watchful eyes. Kowalski's boarding house smelled of soup bone and dry bread. Randy opened the door for Carol, then stepped back, keeping the line they had drawn. "I'll sleep in the stable," he said. "Your window. I'll keep an eye on it." Carol nodded. She did not argue with caution born of respect. In her room, she set down her hat, hung her coat. She took the handkerchief and placed it on the table beside a candle. Flame flickered over the blue letter, as if Elias was called without sound. Carol sat gloves off her fingers, tracing the table's rough wood like touching the church ledger at noon. She closed her eyes, not weeping, though her nose stung. Outside, Randy's boots passed steady, then stilled by the stable. A moment later, the iron latch clicked snug. The West had its own language for protection, the sound of a bolt closing right, the tread of boots. making rounds, not needing thanks. Carol spread the piece of linen Mrs. Dobbins had given her. She threaded a needle, sewed one small straight stitch her way of writing the words she hadn't spoken aloud at the altar, "I will stay." Each stitch a letter, without sound, a second signature beneath the ink. Through the window came night wind, the faint ring of spurs far off. At the church, perhaps the Reverend was snuffing the last candle. At Murphy's, the lock sliding home. In the saloon, the piano had slowed to 2 repeating notes, steady as a town's heart deciding to rest. Carol rose, lit a bit more candle, then pinched it out. She lay down, tucking the handkerchief beneath her pillow, a small rite, needing no witness. Before closing her eyes, she looked at the window. The curtain swayed. Down below, likely he still leaned on the post arms, folded eyes open to keep the night out. "Thank you," Carol whispered. Not to anyone in particular. Perhaps to God. Perhaps to the sage on the altar. Perhaps to Elias, who gave her a way forward. Perhaps to herself, for daring not to need pity. And so ended the first night of a wedding without flowers, quiet and full. No wasted words, no noisy song. Only what would remain at dawn Linenwood, the sound of a latch and a vow without speech. We will treat each other as we treat the winter. Few words, much wood, and knowing when to be still. In that last stillness, Carol drifted into sleep. Outside, Randy shifted boot heel, tapping once against the hard ground, sharp certain like driving a nail firm into a door frame. A covenant had been signed not only in ink, but in presence. And in the vast, unforgiving West, 2 souls had closed the greatest distance of all the space between pity and respect, between strangers and a home. Part 5. The Sewing Shop. Reborn. Morning sunlight streamed through the one small window, slipping past the coarse curtain Carol had stitched the night before. Golden light poured onto the cracked wooden floor, glinting off spools of thread lined neatly on a shelf. The room was so small she could cross it in 3 steps. Yet to Carol, it was an entire new world. She set the old chair she'd bought from Mrs. Kowalski beside the rough work table. On the table lay a pair of broad scissors, spools of colored thread, scraps of cloth. Carol drew in a deep breath. The smell of fresh fabric, sun-warmed air, and old wood filled her chest until it ached. For years, she had dreamed of touching the counter of her own shop again. The fire in Kansas had stolen that. But here, in dry Silver Creek, the dream was being stitched anew. Her first customer came Mrs. Dobbins, holding a torn apron. "Heard you opened a shop." "Brought this," she said. Carol took the apron and mended the tear with a few quick, firm stitches. Mrs. Dobbins accepted it, back lips pressed tight to keep from crying. "Your needle sews more than cloth," she whispered. "It sews trust." When the woman left, Carol sat for a moment, hands trembling. Outside, Randy Mallister leaned against the doorframe, watching. He didn't step in, didn't speak, only gave a small nod before walking away. For a cowboy, that was the highest acknowledgement, to let her stand on her own feet and protect her in silence. The sunlight painted a bright stripe across the table. Carol laid her fingers on it, whispering, "From this day on, I will build again with my own hands." News spread quick. Within days, young women of the town began to appear. The blacksmith's daughter in a patched dress, a young widow wanting to learn a trade to feed her child. They sat around the little wooden table, hands trembling as they tried to thread their needles. Carol looked at their faces, shy but lit with hope. She placed a spool of red thread in the center. Each stitch is a declaration, she told them gently. You are not only sewing cloth, you are sewing your independence. A dress may tear, but your honor must never tear. Clumsy fingers pushed needles. Cloth bunch threads knotted, but soon came nervous laughter. Carol bent over each one, steadying hands, guiding seams patient as though stitching her own life back together. Outside townsfolk paused at the doorway to watch. At first, only curiosity, then quiet nods. A few men sneered, women thinking they can make a trade. But when they saw neat hems on their daughters' skirts, the sneers died. Carol felt something shifting, not only in that cramped room, but in the eyes of the town. The girls around her, every stitch they made stitched something back in her own heart. Fire had destroyed her shop once, but now, from its ashes, something new was sprouting. On the wall, the embroidered handkerchief with the letter E hung like a reminder. A promise had opened this door, and through it, others would learn to mend their faith. One late evening, as Carol locked up, a shout split the alley. A drunken man had seized his wife, striking her hard enough to echo in the dark. The woman wept, pleading. Carol did not step back. She walked forward, her gray eyes lit by the oil lamp's glow. That's enough, she said, her voice quiet but cold as steel. The man sneered, staggering toward her. Who are you to meddle in my house? Carol stood tall, unmoving. I'm the one who'll fetch Sheriff Walker, and the whole town will know, unless you stop now. Heavy breathing, his eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, and faltered. He spat a curse, stumbled back, and left. His wife clutched her face, shaking. You shouldn't have done that. Carol set a hand on her shoulder. No one should live in fear inside their own home. By morning, word had spread. Some called her reckless, others scoffed. But among the women, their looks had changed. In them was gratitude and a spark of hope. Randy heard the tale while tending the horses. He only pressed his lips, offering no comment. Yet that night, his boots traced the street more times than usual. Spurs clicked steady on the boards, a silent shield for the woman who had dared to stand in the dark. One sweltering noon, Clay Dobson swaggered into the shop, tossed a torn shirt onto the table. Sew it. I'll pay later. The young pupil stiffened. Carol lifted her gaze, calm. No, I don't work on promises. Pay first, then I sew. Dobson smirked. It's just a shirt. Who do you think you are? Carol didn't blink. I am Carol Dawson, and in this shop, no one borrows honor. Silence stretched taut. Sweat beaded on his brow. He snatched the shirt, cursed low, and left. The girls behind her burst into quiet, relieved laughter. That afternoon, the town buzzed. Some chuckled at Dobson's humiliation. Others nodded. That woman keeps her rules. That was the day Carol was truly regarded not as the scarred woman, but as a shopkeeper who stood straight. That evening, Randy came by leaning in the doorway, his voice low. You did well? You kept your law. Carol smiled faintly. If I surrender my law, I have nothing. Randy nodded silent a long moment before walking on. In that silence, Carol knew he had begun to see her not as a promise to fulfill, but as an equal. A true partner. Within months, the shop was alive. Mornings, Carol took orders, patching shirts, sewing dresses. Afternoons, she taught the girls. The sound of laughter, the click of scissors, the pricking of needles rose like a new music for Silver Creek. A ragged boy passed by. Carol quietly mended his torn shirt and left it at his door without a word. A widow received a scarf she had sewn weeping as she held something fine for the first time in years. The shop was no longer just for cloth. It was stitching faith. Every seam, closed by Carol's hand, joined not only fabric, but wounds unseen. One late afternoon, Carol watched the light stream through the curtains striping the floor. Outside, Randy leaned on a post, watching in silence. He never stepped inside, never stole her light. But his shadow, long, steady, silent, was protection enough. Carol bent over her stitches, whispering, "I lost a shop to fire. But here, I build again from the ashes. And from now on, I will not only survive, I will live." The handkerchief stirred on the wall. Elias Carter was gone, but his promise lived now, a bright reality. Carol Dawson from ashes had been reborn, not by pity, but by respect and the strength of her own hands. Part 6. Defending the weeknights in Silver Creek were rarely quiet. From the main street came the thump of spurs on boardwalks, rough laughter spilling from the saloon, the thin whine of a banjo. But in the alley, behind Murphy's general store, darkness lay heavy as a damp quilt, swallowing every sound. Carol had just locked the door of her sewing shop. In her hand, she carried a basket of scraps, an oil lamp swinging with each step. That was when the scream tore through the night. A woman's voice, panicked, strangled. Then came the crack of a hard slap. Carol's heart seized. She froze, listening. At the far end of the alley, dim light revealed a drunken man, dragging his wife by the hair, hauling her like a sack. The stench of whiskey drifted with his curses. The woman bent double arms, covering her face, sobbing against his grip. Carol was not one to look away. Her past had taught her too well what it felt like to be cornered. The scar on her cheek never let her forget. And now, watching another woman suffer the same, she could not stand by. She tightened her grip on the lamp and stepped forward. "Stop." Her voice was not loud, but it rang like steel. The man whipped around, eyes bloodshot. "Who's there?" Carol moved closer, the lamp's glow falling across the blood at the corner of the woman's mouth. "That's enough," she said again, lower, sharper. "Let her go, or the whole town will hear." Wind funneled through, shaking the flame. Carol's shadow stretched long across the dirt, a barrier between the drunk and the trembling wife. She knew even a small hand could make a wall. The man snorted, laughing hoarse. "Think you're somebody. You're just a seamstress. Don't meddle in a man's house." Carol stood straighter. When a man's hand turns his house into a place of fear, it stops being private. His snarl came with the reek of liquor. "Shut up, scar-faced hag." He shoved his wife aside and staggered toward Carol, eyes flashing cruelty, hand raised to strike. Carol did not flinch. She lifted the lamp, high light falling across her scar. In that moment, the mark was no longer a badge of pity. It was carved proof I survived. "I am not afraid of you. Go on. Touch me," she said, voice cold as a blade. "Tomorrow, Sheriff Walker will march you down Main Street, and every soul will know you beat your wife." The air thickened. His hand wavered. Behind him, the woman lay on the ground, wide-eyed fear mingled with a fragile hope. The man's jaw clenched. He backed off a step, muttering, "Don't think you've won." He stumbled away, cursing, leaving his wife crumpled in the dark. Carol lowered, the lamp knelt, and helped the woman to her feet. "It's over now," she said gently. "Can you stand?" The woman wept hard. "You shouldn't have. He'll come back." Carol's grip on her shoulder was firm, No one deserves to live in fear inside their own home. Their eyes met, one bruised, one scarred, but in that light, both carried the same fire resilience. By morning, Silver Creek buzzed. At the blacksmith's forge, Carol Dawson stood up to Dobson in the dark. At the saloon, she'll bring trouble meddling in men's affairs. But among the wives, the whispers were different. She did what we only dream. Carol opened her shop as usual. Her hands folded fabric-threaded needles. Yet she felt it eyes on her, some heavy with scorn, others with respect. Her pupils arrived in greater numbers. The blacksmith's daughter blurted out, "Miss Carol, they say you stood in the alley, not afraid of anything." Carol looked up, her gaze soft. "Bravery doesn't mean we don't feel fear. It means we step forward even while the heart trembles." The room went still. Then hands returned to stitching. This time needles moved surer, seams straighter, because they had seen if a scarred woman could stand tall, so could they. Outside, Randy Mallister led his horse down the street. He heard the talk, his eyes drifting to the shop window. He said nothing, only tipped his hat, then walked on. But that silent look, steady as a fence post, spoke louder than any praise. Toward evening, men gathered on the saloon porch, cigarettes glowing in the red light. One spat into the dust. "That Dawson woman's asking for trouble. Men won't take kindly to being shamed." The words reached Carol through her customers. That night, as she locked up, her hand shook. Old fears stirred the fire, the loss, the pitying stares. But through the glass, she saw her girls laughing over their half-finished stitches. She knew if she faltered, they would too. Across the street, Randy lingered in shadow. He had heard the jeers, seen the looks. He lit a cigarette smoke, hiding the tension in his eyes. A surge rose in him, to stride across to declare Silver Creek would not touch Carol Dawson. But he held back. He understood she did not need a knight to rescue her. What she needed was a watchful strength, a steady presence, a shoulder only when she chose to lean. So he stayed where he was letting her, lock the door, lift her chin, and walk past the saloon porch. Men stared, but none dared laugh aloud. Because one thing weighed heavier than rumor, the quiet confidence of a woman who had survived fire, and the silent shadow of a cowboy known for keeping his word even more than his life. A week later, the woman Carol had defended entered the shop. Bruises lingered on her face, but her eyes shone clearer. She laid a scrap of cloth on the counter. "I want to learn sewing if you'll let me." Carol looked at her trembling hands, then smiled. Here no one asks permission to stand tall, only the will to hold a needle. The woman sat clumsy hands, shaking. Carol laid her own gently over them, guiding stitch by stitch. Each seam, she murmured, is one step away from fear. The girls watched, then joined in smiling helping. The little shop glowed as if another lamp had been lit. Outside, Randy leaned on his horse, watching through the window. And for the first time in years, he felt peace stir in his chest. Not because he was keeping Elias's promise, but because he was witnessing another truth. Justice did not always ride with guns and law. Sometimes it came with needle and thread and the courage of a scarred woman. That night, Carol hung a new sign by her door. "Here we mend more than clothes. Here we mend faith." Passers-by stopped to read. Some scoffed, but more than a few nodded quietly. And from then on, in the whispered hopes of Silver Creek's women, One name was spoken not with pity, but with respect. Carol Dawson. Part 7. The Quiet Man. Evening slid down over Silver Creek, the sunlight turning to the color of honey that caught in the throat. In the back room of Murphy's General Store, the old man set a thick ledger on the table, its cover cracked like the hands of one who'd lived through many winters. Dust lay on the high window, and light filtered through in thin shafts, showing specks of flower motes of dust, and the things left unsaid. Randy Mallister sat across from him, hat resting on his knee arms folded loose. He was not a man for circles of talk, and this business called for fewer words than most. On the table lay a small leather pouch heavy with silver. Its sound was not loud, but it carried weight. Murphy cleared his throat as if to swat away a fly that had landed on his hesitation. "Mallister," he rasped voice, "rough as salt? If Miss Carol finds out, her pride will flare like coals." Randy nodded, eyes never leaving the ledger. "That's why I ask you. This isn't pity, just making the start less steep." "How long?" Murphy asked, running a finger along the edge of the book, like stroking the eyelid of a secret. 3 months, Randy said. "Half her rent. After that, she stands on her own." Murphy peered through the door crack where the front bell rang soft. Carol was out there, head bent, measuring cloth for a little girl, her back straight, her mouth set as though to keep her heart from spilling. The old man sighed. "She pays straight every penny. But this town counts coin and gossip as much as silver." He dipped his pen, wrote in the book, "Rent half received. Name." Then he dragged a long line across the blank space, leaving a silence where a name might have been. Randy pushed the pouch forward. Coins slid into Murphy's hand, metal clinking like spurs on wood dry, sure no audience needed. "Recorded another day," he said. "Not on the day she comes to pay." Murphy squinted at him, unsmiling. "Feels like thieving writing books this way," but he glanced once more at Carol, through the murky glass, and his face softened. "All right then. But we'll call it a deposit from the wind." Randy touched his brim. "No signature needed. Folks here know I keep a promise closer than life." The ledger closed with a clap, like a coffin sealing a worry. Randy rose, tall as a fence post, steady against the shifting wind. He left without more words, the way of Western men do the deed walk on. That night, darkness sprawled thick over Silver Creek. Music wavered from the saloon, laughter clinking with glass. Behind the row of houses, the alley by Carol's shop rattled in the dry wind. Randy tied his horse, and Shadow patted its neck and whispered like to a friend who knew how to keep secrets. From his saddle bag, he drew hinges nails, oil a strip of pine shaved smooth. The night had eyes, but also mercy. It watched him measure the door frame, fit the board against the draft drive, each nail soft as a lullaby for fears that once slipped through cracks. Rust fell from old hinges like a snake shedding skin. New hinges swung silent, the door closing snug. The wind kept outside like a beggar too ashamed to step in. He left a bundle of dry wood on the stoop, set a tin of lamp oil on top, and a folded scrap of paper without words, only a crease, a mark between giver and receiver. A jagged splinter on the wall had once torn the curtain. He smoothed it with his knife, tapped in a nail that caught the moonlight like a small fallen star. Not much work, but enough to make a room stand firm against the night. That was Randy's way to shore up the places where the wind slipped in the same way he'd steady cattle when lightning struck, not with shouting, just by standing where he was needed. When the work was done, he stepped back. Cool night air filled his chest. He turned to leave, then heard footsteps inside. Carol. The glow of her lamp spilled through the crack like honey. Randy sank deeper into Shadow Hand, brushing the butt of his gun not to draw, but as a reminder to be still. The door opened a little. Carol's hand touched the new wood. She turned. The latch heard the firm click. She bent, found the firewood, the oil. Moonlight brushed her scar, making it shine like a line of silver script across her cheek. She did not call out. She only set her hand flat on the doorframe, a gesture like resting a palm on a brother's brow. Randy stood unmoving, letting darkness cover him like a blanket. When the door shut again, the candle inside burned straighter, the flame no longer trembling. Something inside his own chest straightened too. He walked away, spurs tapping soft footsteps of a vow no witness needed. Morning came. Carol opened her shop bell, chiming bright. She taught the girls needles, moving steady. Later she went to Murphy to pay rent. The old man slid the ledger forward, numbers written light the burden oddly less than before. Carol raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Murphy, you're going soft." The man coughed, staring past her shoulder. "Miscalculated a few cents. And you've got those girls' chairs cost money." His voice was stiff, but warmth showed at the edges. Carol laid down her coins, each one landing like a heartbeat coming steady. She saw the long blank line drawn where a name should be, a seam of suspicion threaded through. On the page lingered the faint smell of pine pitch, the same scent that clung to her door last night. "You had help, didn't you?" she asked softly, not accusing, just marking the boundary of gratitude. Murphy snapped the book shut. "Help of the wind," he muttered. "And who can catch the wind?" He slid back a few wooden buttons for her pupils, muttering something about extras. His awkward kindness made Carol's lips lift at the corner. On the way back, she touched the new brace on her door, felt the smoothed wood, the mark of a knife well used. Her suspicions thickened into certainty, Randy, but certainty needed no name. Inside, she lifted the embroidered handkerchief a little higher on the wall. Some answers, if spoken aloud, would only weaken what already stood. Better to let the stitches hold. That evening, Randy passed with reins in hand. Carol left her door open wider than usual, letting the sound of scissors drift into the street. Not to boast, just to let the right ears hear all as well. I stand tall. A week later, the bank posted new rates. Rent would rise. Murphy argued, but the landlord shrugged. Numbers don't care if she just found her footing. Randy saw the notice. His chest tightened. He hated when folks were driven cornered like cattle in a narrow gorge. At dawn, he led a fine young steer from his herd, sold it quick at market silver, heavy in his pouch. By noon, he stood at the bank counter, hat low. "This raise, you'll pass it to the small rooms Murphy leases. I'll cover the increase, 3 months. In return, the notice stays as it was, at least for those women earning by hand." The clerk blinked, caught by the name Mallister, like reins snapping tight. He nodded. Coins changed hands. No speeches about justice. Just the quiet math of a cowboy who knew sometimes silver held more weight than bullets. That night, Murphy handed Randy a warm loaf from Mrs. Dobbins' oven. "From her, not me," he muttered. failing to hide a twitch of thanks. Randy accepted without words. Later, Carol overheard voices in Murphy's back room. Leave the name blank. Randy. No mark needed. Randy again. She paused at the door frame, heart quick. She could have stepped in, demanded truth. Instead, she waited. Then she knocked lightly, giving them time to cover the ledger. When she entered, Randy only asked, "Your shop holding steady?" His tone casual, but his eyes carried weather. "Steady," she answered. "And last night." The door no longer rattled. Seems the wind has learned respect. Their eyes met one moment, thick as cloth, heavier than air. Then he touched his brim and turned. "Mr. Mallister," she called soft as a loose thread. He paused. "Your saddle stitching is fraying. Leave it on my step tonight. In the morning it'll be sound." So it went. That night, Randy left the saddle. Carol mended it with thick hemp thread, each lock stitch pulling her heart down, a rung steadying. In return, Randy left fresh horseshoes, a fine knife for heavy cloth. No names. Just gifts like cross stitches, meeting holding unseen. At dawn he touched the new seam, a line firm and clean. His mouth eased at last like rain slackening. Carol found his token and smiled. No one said love. That word was fragile. Instead, they spoke in wood hinges, saddles, and thread-hard things that could bear the wind. In Silver Creek, a tale began to spread. There's a man who stands behind a woman without needing to stand in front. Everyone knew the names, though none were spoken. And in a West, where gunfire often spoke louder than hearts, what folks remembered longest were the deeds done in silence. Part 8. A confession in the storm. All of Silver Creek lay buried beneath a heavy quilt of snow, as though the sky itself had dropped its blanket. The wind howled through every crack in every wall, driving white dust into the corners of the street. Wooden signs shook on their chains, and the few street lamps swayed like lonely spirits in the gale. Inside the sewing shop, the fire glowed, throwing warm light across the bolts of cloth hanging on the walls. They were the only patches of color holding back the blizzard outside. Carol sat at her work table, needle still in her hand, though she had forgotten to stitch. Her gray eyes followed the flakes striking the window, melting into trails of water. She felt as if the storm were not only clawing at the roof, but tearing through her chest as well. From the porch came the sound of spurs, low, steady, certain. The door burst open, and the wind rushed in with the tall shadow of a cowboy. Randy Mallister shook the snow from his shoulders and shut the door hard against the storm. A night like this, his voice rough, but warm, ain't fit for being alone. Carol gave a faint smile, hiding the tremble in her eyes. "I've grown used to being alone, Mr. Mallister." Randy said nothing. He pulled off his gloves, laid them on the table by the lamp. The golden light caught his weathered face, the deep-set eyes carrying words he had never spoken. He looked at her a long moment, as if every other sentence in the world had been blown away by the wind, and only one remained. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm roared. But in that small room, the silence grew thick, like the moment before a needle pierces cloth. Randy leaned against the table, hands clasped as though holding back something wrestling in his chest. Carol bent her head, pretending to study her thread, though it was only to hide the heat rising in her cheeks. Never had the space between them felt so fragile, just one breath, and it might vanish. He spoke slowly, each word chosen, as if a wrong one might shatter the air. Carol, all this time I thought I was only keeping a promise for Elias. But he paused, eyes on the fire. Somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing where my friend's wish ended and where my own heart began. Carol lifted her head. The scar along her cheek caught the firelight, shining like a mark of destiny. Are you saying? Randy nodded once. I'm not here out of pity, not out of duty anymore. Carol, I want you. Not as a debt I owe, but as breath itself. The words landed heavy, rippling through her heart, like a stone breaking still water. For months she had bricked herself behind walls, telling her soul she was only a companion by circumstance. But now those walls began to crack. Her hands tightened. Her voice shook. Mr. Mallister, I've long since stopped believing in gentle words. This scar has taught me how people see me, as a burden. Randy stepped forward. His boots rang low on the wooden floor. He stopped before her, bent down until his eyes met hers. To me, that scar is proof you walked through a fire others would never survive. Carol, it's the very reason I respect you, and the reason I love you. The room fell so still, it seemed even the storm outside held its breath. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not turn away. For the first time, someone had called her scar a reason to love. Her chest ached with memory. The fire in Kansas, swallowing her shop. The screams, the smell of burning wood and flesh. The cruel whispers in every town since scarred woman. Each word like a knife. And now, here was a cowboy whose hands had held reins against stampeding cattle, whose back had stood between danger and a friend, looking at her without flinch, without shame. She whispered, voice breaking, if tomorrow this whole town mocks you for choosing me, will you regret it? Randy slid a calloused hand across the table, pushing aside the heavy shears, clearing away the last barrier between them. Let them call me mad. 34 years I've lived, and no rumor ever fed my heart. But one look from you keeps it alive. Her breath hitched. The walls inside her gave way like rotten timber in a storm. Randy's hand rose, hovering a moment, then touched the scar on her cheek. Gently. Not pity, recognition. This was part of her written in survival. Carol closed her eyes, a sob escaping, as tears ran hot against his rough hand. He did not pull away. Snow whirled outside, thick enough to hide the world. But in the sewing shop, something else was revealed. A wound, when seen with love, could turn into proof of life. Randy lowered his brow to hers. Their breath mingled warm in the chill, still clinging to his coat. His voice was a whisper, husky as wind through pine. Carol, from this day, it isn't a promise anymore. It's me. I choose you. She opened her eyes. In his pupils, she saw both the storm and the calm beyond it. She smiled through her tears, trembling. You're strange, Mallister. I've loved you for weeks now, but I held it in, afraid if I spoke it would all collapse. He shook his head. Not collapse. Begin. And then his lips found hers, unhurried, steady, tender, as a hand resting sure on a gun's worn grip. Their first kiss shy yet deep, like two rivers breaking free of ice and joining into one. Carol gave a small gasp, then yielded her hands, rising to his shoulders. The smell of horsehide, of winter wind, of burning wood mingled between them, the scent of a new beginning. Outside, the storm raged on. But within, love wrapped them in a silence stronger than snow. Bolts of cloth needles, the embroidered E on the wall, all bore witness. Not duty, but choice had bound them now. By morning, the storm had left a white crown on every roof. Light burst dazzling from the drifts. Carol opened her shop door, breathing deep of the new day. Randy stood beside her coat, frosted white eyes squinting at the sun. She glanced at him, voice low. "Last night? It was real, wasn't it?" He nodded. "I told you no longer a promise. If you'll have it, it's a road we walk together." She looked down at her hand, the one he'd held to her scar. She clenched it strong. "I'll take it. But I'll walk beside you as your equal, never as a shadow." His lips curved the rare softness of a man who smiled little. "That's all I ever wanted. A partner, not a shadow." And so, under the first clear sky, after the storm, they walked side by side down Main Street. The townsfolk paused, whispers trailing after them. But Carol held her head high, and Randy walked steady at her side, a silent wall of strength. The vow, spoken in a night of snow, was enough to silence all the winds of the world. Back in the shop, the fire still glowed. Smoke curled upward, like a long sigh. And on the wall, the handkerchief, with its blue E, remained a witness to a promise that had blossomed into love. Part 9. Building a future together. Dawn slid through the ranch kitchen window like a lazy golden cat. On the wooden table, Randy spread out a map of the land, pencil squares. Rough and uneven waves of lines marked Old Ditch Sand Ridge dry season pasture. Beside it, Carol laid her thin-bound ledger, its neat columns straight as stitched seams. The smell of coffee rose mixing with saddle leather and the faint ash of the stove. "Run the fence another mile here." Randy tapped the pencil over a low patch. "Next season's calves won't spill down to the creek." He lifted his eyes steady in the pale morning light. "And that flat stretch on the north ridge you spoke of, flax. Tell me the plan again." Carol pulled from her pocket a blue thread, the same blue as the embroidered E hanging on their wall. She pinned it through the map across the flatland. "Sow before the late frost lifts. When stalks reach a hand's height, pull them up whole-bind into sheaves. Soak them in board-lined vats to loosen the fiber, then dry comb and spin. Men will build the vats. Women will spin. Pay by the pound of fiber." Her words were slow, precise, counted like stitches. Randy listened, nodding. He had lived by giving orders. Now he was learning to listen. "And water-cut rain trenches. Rig a wind pump from the shallow well into a wooden trough." She turned a page, pointing at neat rows of numbers. "The first year lean but steady. The second year we sell both fiber and cloth." The curtain shifted in the morning breeze. Randy marked flax 10 acres in pencil, then looked at her. "I trust your plan." He paused, weighing another word. "I trust us." Carol kept silent, letting the word us rest, warm upon the table, like a coin just laid down. She drew the embroidered handkerchief from her pocket, set it by the map's corner. "Let the one who led us here sit with us still." A thin smile. "And remind us what we plant is more than flags. It's a way for people here to stand tall." Randy set his hat on the chair back. "This afternoon I'll ride to Morrison. That fence land belongs to him." "I'll go," Carol answered, natural, as adding another row of stitches. "He'll hear a plan, not a plea." The fire cracked softly. By the door, the old dog yawned, tail thumping. Outside, frost clung to grass. Inside, the blue thread, pinned to the map, quivered but held. A future was being sown with few words and 2 willing hands. The day they raised the vats, the ranch turned into a workshop. Pine boards dropped into place, seams packed with clay straw stuffed into cracks to hold water. Randy stood at the head of the first pit, gave 3 sharp calls, and the ranch hands dropped the boards in unison. The hollow sound of wood meeting wood echoed like a drum. Wind caught the loose straw, and the sky stretched clean after winter's gray. Carol's scarf tied over her hair held a list in one hand, 2 on frames, 3 on trenches. Under the porch, we'll set a spinning wheel. Those who are quick of hand come learn. Young town girls stepped shyly forward, their fingers still smelling of flour and soap. Carol guided their hands to the wheel, pressed a foot upon the treadle. The wheel, humming like a heartbeat, returning to strength. By noon, a native woman rode in hair-braided thick dress, soft as deerskin eyes, deep as still water. Murphy muttered, "That's Nimi Shoshone." Carol went out with an open hand. Welcome. In Kansas, I knew silk. Here I want to learn the fiber of this land the right way. Nimi touched the tip of Carol's needle and smiled. You spin with wheels. My people braid by hand. Both are strong if you respect the fiber. She taught them how to test flax in the vats, listen for the faint crack, how to dry, with the right wind, twist the wrist to keep fibers whole. Carol paid fairly in cloth food and shares of what would be sold. By afternoon, the first wind pump was raised. Randy climbed the ladder, hands black with pitch sun bright on his brow. Wind caught the blades, turned them slow, then faster. The pipe roared, water splashed like threads of silver. Laughter burst from the women. Children ran feet, muddy faces bright. Carol leaned on a post chest, rising with each spin. She saw something new. The ranch was no longer only cattle and men. It held the hum of wheels, the laughter of women, the smell of wet flax and fresh wood. Nimi sat in shade, telling the children stories of her people plaiting rope through long winters, tales of quiet endurance. The children hushed, drinking it in. Randy came down, standing at Carol's side. They didn't say good work. They didn't call it victory. They only watched the blades turn, the water strike the vat. This time next year, Randy said softly, we'll weave our first cloth. Carol shook her head, smiling. No. By autumn, we'll have a small piece, already enough to wrap a newborn. The wind turned the pump another round. Clouds pulled thin across the sky. Hands once timid now held fibers firm. This was a Western story, without gunfire work shaping community respect, shaping a home. They faced Morrison first. He sat behind a scarred desk, fingers drumming, eyes sharp as a whetted knife. Fences, ditches, pumps. Mallister, you trying to build a factory out there? Randy's voice stayed even. Trying to build something that'll outlast a dry season. He tipped his chin toward Carol. She speaks for the numbers. Carol opened her ledger. 10 acres of flax, seed boards, labor, then fiber, then cloth. The first season, thin profit. By harvest, we already have buyers. She laid down 3 signed orders. Morrison smirked. A woman with figures. That's rare. Carol met his eyes. Try delivering a wedding dress a day late. Numbers can cost more than money. He barked a laugh, scratched a figure on paper. The price wasn't sweet, but it was fair. Randy looked to Carol. She nodded. The pen scratched. The deal was sealed. At the bank, the clerk sniffed. Rates went up last month. Carol laid down her plans. the orders, the backup sums. Randy set a leather pouch of cattle money on the desk. We don't ask favor. We ask fair for honest work. The man studied their eyes, not pleading, but straight. He cut the rate by a notch. Not pity, respect for what was solid. That evening, Randy carved a post. He cut M into it, Malister, then handed the knife to Carol. She carved D. Dawson small, but true. Side by side, not tangled. She tied a strip of blue thread around the notch. Randy drove the post, deep 3 blows of the hammer ringing steady. The ranch had a new gate and a new promise, invisible but real. Spring storms came clouds, swollen stones of ice hammering the roof. Randy shouted the men to herd calves, tie down tarps. Carol and the women ran to the flax frames, ropes biting their hands, hail stinging skin raw. A post gave the frame tilted. She clutched the canvas jaw locked. Hold it. Randy lashed rope around his waist, shouldered the frame beside her. Hail cut at them like whips, but they stood. Girls ran in with boards on their heads for cover. Nimi drove another tarp across, with her staff murmuring a prayer low and steady. An hour passed. The storm spent itself, retreating into silence. White stones lay thick on the ground. The frame stood battered, but standing. Carol dropped to the steps, soaked and bruised. Randy knelt, checking her arm where fabric had torn. Hurts. Yes, she said, breath ragged but laughing, but not broken. He tore a strip of cloth, bound her arm with a knife-sharp skill. Inside, calves bawled for mothers. Outside, tarps dripped steady. On the porch, a kettle of tea steamed in Mrs. Dobbins's hands. By night, they counted the loss. Some flax ruined, but most saved. Randy frowned, then eased. We lost, but not all. Carol's eyes were calm. We never asked easy, only worthy. He handed her his own shirt, ripped in the storm. Carol smiled, stitched it with a strong locking seam. This stitch, she whispered, means don't break. He looked at the sure line eyes warming. The storm had passed. In the hearth, the fire crackled like a child sleeping. By autumn, sweet air moved across the ridge. The flax was spun, combed, and stretched taut on the loom Carol had built. Her shuttle tapped steady sunlight, falling on the cloth as it grew. Girls sat wide-eyed, watching threads cross like a stream. Randy leaned on a post, coffee in hand. He didn't call it beautiful, because beauty wasn't the goal. What they sought was strong, able to stand through winter and hail. And the first piece of cloth, small and plain, was born from this land, this water, these hands that had learned to stand. Carol cut it, folded it tied with a ribbon, thin as grass. The first child born in Silver Creek this year, she said, will be wrapped in this. Women laughed softly, eyes wet. Nimi touched the cloth, nodded a blessing, without words. That night, Randy set a long table outside. Beans, cornbread, beef roasting. Ranch hands, town women, children, even the Reverend, each brought something. Plates passed, stories shared. Carol rose only once. Thank you, she said, for giving these hands work and this heart a place to stay. Then she sat. No more words were needed. Randy lifted his cup. On this land, we survive by each other. He set it down, drew out a carved plaque. Upon it, E.M.D. One letter for Elias, one for Malister, one for Dawson, side by side. Hang it on the porch, he said. Let every soul know the name of this house. Carol touched E first, then M, then D, and let them know a promise kept long enough becomes a home. She hung the board. The autumn wind made it chime like a little bell. As dusk fell, blackbirds flew arrow straight toward the mountains. Children ran, new cloth fluttering. Ranch hands played slow tunes on guitar, steady as a loom. In the shadows, Randy and Carol stood shoulder to shoulder. After this harvest, Randy whispered, "We'll build a small house east for those who need shelter." "And a class corner big enough for 10 girls," Carol answered. "So each season, Silver Creek will have 10 more hands able to stitch their own lives." On the wall, the blue stitched handkerchief still hung. On the table, the new cloth lay folded. At the gate spurs rang once, then stilled someone late, or someone returned. The story would go on through days, quiet as bread and beans. At the Mallister Dawson Ranch, they had learned how to raise cattle without stripping the land, how to grow flax without wasting people, how to love without losing pride. And when night fell, the wind slipped soft across the porch, brushed the plaque of 3 letters, and seemed to whisper, "Today we begin again." Part 10. The Handkerchief with the Letter. A night wrapped the ranch like a heavy wool blanket, thick, cold, and still. Outside, wind howled through the new fence line, sweeping white dust across the yard like scattered ash. In the wooden bedroom, the fire snapped and breathed, throwing Randy's shadow tall across the wall, like the trunk of an old tree that had stood through 100 storms. Carol slept. A weary smile lingered at her lips, the kind that comes only after a long day of weaving and tallying a new season's plans. Her hair spilled loose across the pillow. The scar on her cheek caught a shimmer of firelight, no longer something to hide, now a mark of survival. Randy sat on the bed's edge, rough hands holding something small, the old handkerchief embroidered with a single letter E in blue thread. For months, it had rested in his chest pocket, through long rides, hailstorms nights keeping watch by the calves. It wasn't just cloth. It was a tether binding him to a man buried under the snow, Elias. He looked at Carol, chest rising, then tightening again. And only now, while she slept in peace, did he dare do what his heart had carried for weeks. He opened his hand, laid the cloth beside her pillow, letting the fringe brush her hair. The blue letter caught the fire's glow, like a faint star falling onto their roof. Something loosened inside him. The debt was paid, not just by marrying Carol, not just by protecting her, but by walking with her until together they had built a true home. Setting down the handkerchief closed the vow. Yet it also opened something else. Love no longer living in the shadow of a promise. Wind moaned across the porch. Randy lifted his eyes and whispered into the dark, "Rest easy, Elias." I kept it. In her sleep, Carol turned fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. Even in dreams, she felt it soft, cool, strangely familiar. She saw snow swirling white, Elias smiling from the storm, holding out the blue handkerchief. But his face faded, leaving only a voice. "It's not me. It's him." She woke. The fire had burned down to coals glowing soft and low. The cloth lay faintly lit at her side. Lifting it, her fingers trembled. The stitches were steady, even like seams holding life together. She glanced at Randy. He had fallen asleep in the wooden chair chin on his chest coat, still carrying the smell of night air. Her heart swelled aching. This was Elias's token, yet Randy had borne it. It had been a chain, but he had made it into a bridge. She pressed it to her chest, tears falling quietly. Not tears of pity or fear. Tears of farewell, farewell to the burning past, so she could receive the peace of the present. Rising, Carol draped a blanket across Randy's shoulders. In that simple act, she saw clearly this man had not only kept his friend's vow, He had chosen her, chosen this love with his own heart. And the blue handkerchief was no longer the memory of the dead. It was proof that loyalty could give birth to happiness. Roosters called from the barn. Dawn poured honey-colored light across the wooden walls. Carol brewed coffee, its warmth filling the room. Randy stirred eyes red from sleep. On the table, the handkerchief lay neatly folded. "You set it here?" Carol asked softly, as though afraid to break the silence. Randy sat fingers laced together. "Yeah, it's time it left my pocket. It belongs with you." Carol placed it back in his hands. "No, it belongs to all three of us. You, me, and Elias." He looked at her, then at the cloth, and in her eyes there was no shadow of pity or burden, only calm and love. He nodded, folding the square, once more, setting it on the table, as if placing a Bible at the heart of a meal. "You kept the vow," Carol whispered, "but I think Elias never meant for me to live as someone's weight. You turned his promise into a home. That's the gift he left." Randy smiled, a rare smile, warm as sun after storm. His calloused hand covered hers. "Maybe so, but I'll always owe him, because without him, I'd never have known I needed someone." The room filled with coffee steam and the soft pop of burning logs. A simple moment, but rich like sap in a tree. The place where cowboys learn love doesn't need many words, only presence. That morning, Silver Creek gathered at Carol's shop. The first flax cloth was ready. Folks didn't just come to buy, they came to see if a scarred woman's hands could truly make something that would last. Carol spread the cloth on the table. Sunlight poured across it, glowing steady. Fingers reached to touch. An old woman whispered, "That's good work." A young girl looked up, eyes shining. "Teach me." From the crowd came Murphy's voice. "This woman was broken once. Now she teaches us to stand." Heads nodded. Old whispers faded. Respect remained. At the door, Randy stood in his hat, saying nothing. He didn't step inside, but his eyes softened as Carol smiled, a true smile, no longer forced. When the crowd thinned, Carol tied a strip of the new fabric around the embroidered E and hung it on the wall. "This is Elias's greeting to Silver Creek," she said clear. "A reminder that from loss we can weave hope." The shop fell quiet. Then one clap, then another. Soon the sound spread firm, steady, like spurs striking saloon boards. Randy turned away, heavy and light at once. He knew then the handkerchief was no longer only his friend's relic. It was a flame warming the whole town. Late that night the ranch rested. Cattle lowed in the distance like a lullaby. Stars spilled silver across the sky, like cloth laid wide. Inside, Carol sewed a child's dress by the fire. Randy entered carrying the scent of night wind. He watched her, and peace rose in him. This was home. She glanced up, smiling. "Long day, but I'm not tired." He sat silent a while, then drew the handkerchief from his pocket one last time. He had carried it all day, as if to test whether he was ready. Now he set it beside the lamp. From here on, it isn't a burden. It's a keepsake, like a picture on a church wall. Carol knotted her last stitch, cut the thread, and folded the cloth. She placed it on the mantel above the fire, where all who enter will see. Randy's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her gently in. "We've kept it. Now we're allowed to live." Outside, the wind fell silent. Inside, firelight warmed the wall's shadows of two figures stretched long and close. The embroidered E glowed faint and blue like a private star over their home. A vow fulfilled, a love begun. And in the wide West, the greatest legacy was not land or cattle, but a promise kept to the very end until it turned into a roof and hearth for the living. Snow thickened on the ranch fence, covering the carved gate with its 3 letters, M-D-E. Above it, the moon hung pale a silver stitch in the fabric of night. By the fire, Randy watched Carol sleeping, her scar shining soft as a finished seam, no longer a wound, but proof of a life mended. He breathed deep, whispered, as if Elias still lingered in the storm friend. I kept it, but what I received is far greater, a home, a strong woman, a future. The fire crackled in answer. Snow fell steady, and in that quiet, a cowboy's heart finally rested. A promise kept with the whole heart can turn fate into love. Justice and healing often whisper louder than any vow shouted. Do you believe a promise can change a life? If it were you, would you keep it out of duty or out of love? And if you were in the cowboy's boots, would you stay to guard the town or ride off into the wild? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because in the vast West, legends aren't always made by gunfire. Sometimes they are born when a cowboy keeps his word through the storm and finds love among falling snow.